It had been more than 10 days since the outbreak of the apocalypse. Apart from those who were well protected by the military, most people felt that they had an adequate degree of survival skills. Those who were under the protection of the military were also causing less trouble. Charles knew that, as time passed, shortages of food and drinking water would become severe. People would have no choice but to fight the zombies and steal from the empty homes and stores in the territories occupied by the monsters. Unfortunately, the more dangerous a place was, the more resources would be available. Even ordinary people could steal things from under the zombies' noses if it was a relatively safe area and the people were smarter than average. Since Lena had followed him on his current expedition, Charles didn't want to choose a place that was too dangerous. Instead, he decided on the marginally safer city of Laval because it was close to the Montreal military district. The people in the city had been evacuated early, and most of the monsters had been cleared out by the army. Although many monsters had invaded again later, Charles considered the risk to be within an acceptable range. Once they arrived at their destination, Charles suggested to Tommy and Hugh that they scout the area. Nodding, they turned to Elena and the others and said, "Follow us and keep your eyes open for any danger nearby. Also, if you see anything worth collecting along the way, make sure you grab it." The others looked nervously at Charles, who seemed happy with those orders. "Shouldn't a paranormal take the lead?" Lena asked, sounding worried. "Isn't this a dangerous area?" She believed that those with the greatest ability ought to shoulder more responsibility. Everyone else seemed to agree with her assessment, but Charles groaned at the prospect, feeling a headache coming on. "If the paranormals take the lead," he said, "then who's going to be responsible for rescuing them when they run into danger?" Of course, that wasn't the real reason he was unwilling to take the lead. To retain his position, Charles knew he had to allow them to make some of their own plans and enact them without him. He had managed to win their admiration, but if he lost their respect, then he risked losing his position. He shouted at them, "What are you waiting for? Hurry up and go." No one hesitated further. They followed Tina and the others and investigated the surrounding area. Charles had supplied them with weapons he had forged using some metal from the tool factory. Although the weapons didn't have any military-grade abilities or accuracy-enhancing functions, they were still well made and better than most industrial-grade tools. After sending everyone else away, Charles turned to Alice. "I'll go and make sure the rest of them don't run into any danger." Then he looked at Tina and Lena. "You two stay in the car." Alice nodded. Meanwhile, Lena was pleased with Charles's thoughtfulness, taking it as evidence her brother had a soft heart in spite of his sharp tongue. On the surface, he presented a cold exterior to people, but she was positive he really was concerned about their well-being. Tina appeared to share her thoughts. "When we face monsters, strength and equipment are important," she said, "but what's really needed is the courage to face them with intelligence." Lena nodded. She was proud of her brother. Tina, however, didn't believe Charles was particularly concerned about the group's safety. She knew that he had a storage space. It was obvious why he had wanted to go alone. He was simply stealing things that might be important later. Her assumption was correct. Charles had left Tina and Lena with a communicator so they could send out a distress signal if they needed him. Then, instead of following the other group, he made his way to a nearby street that he knew well. He had been there in his previous life and had found supplies there. This time, the supplies had been almost completely depleted by other looters. In his previous life, when he had entered a nearby warehouse, he found a bag of biscuits in an empty corner. This time, though, the warehouse door was locked. When he managed to force open the door, Charles saw that the warehouse was full of food and other useful materials, and he gave an audible gasp of surprise. During his last experience of the apocalypse, he had never seen so many items at once. Once he had shaken off his surprise, he immediately set to work. His strength had already reached the 3rd or 4th level, and his energy storage space had increased with both his strength and with time. It seemed to have undergone other changes that made the space feel different, but he couldn't quite pinpoint what they were, and he didn't have time to examine it. He figured that it probably wasn't important. After he had emptied the entire warehouse, Charles moved on to the next shop. He was aware that the shortage of resources would cause more and more super squads of paranormals to appear. Such teams relied on their superior strength to take everything useful that they could get their hands on. Charles's team was quite small, and any unexpected appearance of the super-evolved warriors would spark a massive fight for resources that he and his group might not win. And once a super squad had swept through a place, it would be almost impossible to find such a warehouse full of items. Charles sifted through the second store, finding tables, chairs, cupboards, and air conditioning units. He took a few of the air conditioners for their parts, but everything else was useless to him. After killing a few zombies, he managed to reach a hospital. It was abandoned and derelict, but he knew that in his last lifetime, he had found many useful drugs there. He also realized that some of the medical equipment would become precious in the future, particularly since, as more time passed, most drugs would become scarce. In the early stages of the apocalypse, the harsh living environment would soon cause many people to become sick. And without medicine, even minor ailments had the potential to become fatal. Even a box of anti-inflammatory drugs could be exchanged for food, which would be enough to sustain his team for a few days. Charles made his way through several rooms, emptying shelves as he went. Just as he was about to enter the operating theater to see what it had to offer, he heard movement, and instinctively retreated to a corner to hide. A group of people entered, and Charles grew apprehensive. When he saw the face of one of the people in the group, however, he stepped forward to make his presence known. "Elliot?" he cried in disbelief. "I didn't expect to see you here." In his previous life, Charles had never found out what had become of Elliot in the aftermath of the apocalypse. He had never allowed himself to think the worst, because he hadn't wanted to dwell on the gloomy prospect of what had happened to the people he had cared about. In just 1 month, almost half of the population of the country had been lost. It had been normal for people to go missing, only for their bodies to turn up days later, and Charles had found he couldn't dwell on the losses without falling into a deep depression. Instead, he had desensitized himself to death and focused on survival. But with his current team and better prospects for the future, he thought it might be beneficial to reconnect with his old friend and even potentially forge an alliance. After all, if he couldn't correct the mistakes and regrets he had from his previous life, then there was little point to his rebirth. When Elliot saw Charles, he was astounded. "Charles?" he exclaimed. "My God, I didn't expect to see you here." A large, muscular man stood next to him, and he appeared to be the squad leader. He examined Charles closely and frowned, asking, "Elliot, do you know this guy?" "Don't worry about him," Elliot said, his voice shaking with excitement. "He's my friend from college. I promise he's completely trustworthy." But Charles still sensed a lot of suspicion emanating from the muscular man, and when he noticed the emblem on his clothing, his eyes narrowed slightly. The symbol was the mark of Stellar Technology. The leader seemed to notice the hostility in Charles's eyes. "What are you looking at?" he demanded. "Have you got a problem with me?" He advanced a few steps closer to Charles. "Elliot, the only reason I'm not already beating the hell out of this guy is because of you. I suggest you tell your friend to fix his face, or I'll happily do it for him." Elliot seemed to acknowledge the precariousness of the situation, and he hurriedly appealed to Charles. "Come on, man," he said. "What's wrong? Finn's a good guy, so why are you looking at him like that?" "How did you fall in with this lot?" Charles asked. "My dad works for Stellar Technology," Elliot explained. "After the disaster, the CEO of Stellar Technology organized a team of people to build a base for the survivors. Since employees as family members were invited, I was allowed to join them. That's why we're here, actually. The supplies of the base were getting a little low, so we came out to look for some more." Charles was startled, but he quickly grasped the meaning of the situation. Elliot had joined Stellar Technology. It suddenly made sense why he had never found out what had happened to him. Elliot had lived in Montreal, so his chances of survival had been higher than most, and he would have needed to be particularly unlucky for something bad to have happened to him. But Charles knew that Elliot's position was dangerous. If he had joined Stellar Technology, then they would expect him to be useful to them. And if he didn't want to continue working for them once they revealed their true colors, then his only remaining purpose to them would be as an experimental subject. Whatever the situation was, it seemed likely that Elliot hadn't had much of a choice in the matter. Finn tried to impress Charles, telling him, "In this dangerous era, Stellar Technology holds great power and is willing to provide a safe place for the survivors. If you want to join us, then we'll give you a chance since you know Elliot. But I want you to wipe that condescending look off your face." Elliot hurriedly added, "Think about it, Charles. This is a rare opportunity. You have no idea how powerful they are." A few people took out their weapons. 2 of them had silencers attached to high-powered guns, while the rest had either sharp axes or knives. Even Elliot had a machete hanging from his waist, although he hadn't touched it. "Look," Charles said to him. I know you're saying this for my own good, and because you think you're doing the right thing. But you don't know what kind of operation Stellar Technology is really running. The only people they ever look out for are themselves. Although he knew Elliot believed he was speaking the truth, Charles couldn't ever agree to join Stellar Technology. He would rather die. He turned to Finn and said, Please understand, it's nothing personal. I'm not against you. I'm against the corporation you work for. Finn laughed loudly, and all the people behind him joined in. You're against the corporation? He repeated incredulously. Are you honestly trying to stick it to the man during an apocalypse? You're a little fish, and you have no idea about the sharks you're swimming with. I'll let you beg for mercy now if you like. It'll save you time later. Elliot grew anxious. Wait! He pleaded with Finn, trying to restore peace. He turned back to Charles. These weapons aren't all we have, he confessed. They have methods that can strengthen the human body, which allows ordinary people to have abilities on par with paranormals. You were always a smart guy, so you must know what that means, right? A method to strengthen the human body? Charles thought, shocked. Is he talking about the genetic enhancement pill? Martial artists had long since learned how to teach people to tap into their capabilities and strengthen their bodies. But the genetic enhancement pill would give humans the capacity to resist medicinal paranormals. Charles was confused about how Stellar Technology had managed to discover the technology so quickly. He subtly used his power of thunder to sense the energy levels of Elliot's group, and he gave a silent whisper of thanks when he realized there was no trace of experimentation on their bodies. Even if they had already consumed the genetic enhancement pill, the science obviously wasn't at a stage where it could be mass-produced. This meant that Stellar Technology hadn't made any fundamental progress compared to what they had achieved in Charles's previous life. The most effect any pill would currently have on them was to make their strength comparable to an ordinary paranormal. That realization calmed Charles's mind significantly, because he understood that they were no further advanced than he was. They might have the theoretical knowledge to make the drug, but they still lacked the physical capabilities to produce it in sufficient quantities. One of the primary ingredients could only be obtained from mutated zombies, which couldn't be defeated by anyone other than trained martial artists with above-average abilities. Finn looked at Charles, who was deep in thought, and he saw his eyes flash with what he thought was a trace of greed. He understood the allure of the genetic enhancement pill, and he assumed Charles was tempted by the idea. Perhaps you've simply misunderstood the intentions of Stellar Technology, he said in a silky voice. But I can tell you, it's actually a very tolerant company. How about we overlook our little misunderstanding? If you want to join us, then I can put in a good word for you. Charles raised an eyebrow. Join you as what? He asked, his tone mocking. A test subject? Charles's tone was soft, but his words created a huge shift in the atmosphere of the room. Everyone present knew of the existence of the drug, but they weren't necessarily aware that it was only in its test phase. But Charles knew that it was only once it progressed from its current embryonic form that it would begin its clinical trial. Finn gripped the sword in his hand, and a cruel look appeared in his eyes. What are you talking about? He demanded. He had obviously not expected Charles to know anything about the situation. Explain yourself, or I'll slit your throat right here, Elliot's friend or not. Charles shrugged. I mean, any new medicine has to go through clinical trials, right? It's not hard to guess that it's only in the testing phase. Elliot looked at Finn in disbelief, as if he was hearing such information for the first time. Is that true? He asked quietly. Finn replied, I suppose there's no point denying it, so yes, it's still being tested. We sometimes need to use people as experimental subjects, but those who are loyal to Stellar Technology will be the beneficiaries of these tests. Your father is an employee, so as long as you perform well, we'll make sure that you possess the strength of a paranormal. Charles saw the look in Elliot's eyes and knew he believed what Finn was saying. Charles was neither surprised nor disappointed by his reaction. He knew the temptation of possessing strength comparable to a paranormal must be a huge draw for an ordinary person, and he didn't know many people who would refuse a promise like that. He had to admit that, if he had never come across the ancient book, then he would have been tempted as well. Sacrifices for medical advancements are understandable, Charles admitted. It's an essential part of scientific evolution. The tension in the room eased a little at his words. Finn gave him a curt smile. Then he stretched out his hand and said, Welcome. But Charles took a step back and ignored Finn's outstretched hand. I should clarify, he continued. If other people are happy to volunteer to be guinea pigs for an untested drug, that's fine by me, but don't expect me to do so. Elliot was undeterred by Charles's attitude. Don't worry, Charles, you don't have to be a guinea pig. I can do the early test for you. Charles shook his head and said, You're a good guy, and I know you mean well, but you don't carry enough weight at the company. If their drug needs to go through several rounds of testing, it won't just be me who needs protecting. It'll be you. Do you really think they'll let you stop trialing it for them once you've agreed to do it once? Before the cultivation method had been popularized, the number of people who would be sacrificed had been enough to make Charles's head spin. Even he, as hardened and desensitized as he was, found it hard to remain indifferent to the amount of human suffering that would take place in the name of scientific progress. Knowing Elliot would be one of those sacrificed left him feeling even more disturbed. You don't know anything about it, Finn said. Then he narrowed his eyes and called, Extreme Light Slash! The sword in his hand suddenly flashed toward Charles. Charles knew the power of the Extreme Light Slash. It could seriously injure even a level 3 paranormal. Fortunately, he had already known that this confrontation was likely to result in violence, so he'd been prepared to dodge the attack. Then, when Finn struck again, the blood-drinking sword appeared in Charles's hand. Don't move, Charles shouted. When Elliot saw that the situation had devolved into a fight, his eyes shone with anxiety. But just as he was about to attack, one of his teammates aimed a gun at him. I don't want to hurt you, his teammate said earnestly, but I don't want you to make the wrong choice. Since both guys are your friends, then you shouldn't get involved. Besides, Finn's probably not going to kill him. After all, we still need test subjects. Elliot was shocked. You knew about that? His teammate's eyes betrayed a hint of panic, but he quickly regained his composure and said, I found out at the same time you did. At first I was a little worried, but think about it. If we help the company capture enough people to experiment on, then it's less likely they'll use us. It's dog eat dog now. Only useful people have a place here, so anyone who refuses to help has no worth. Which side are you on? Your friend is already a paranormal, so do you expect him to protect you like a little kid? Or do you want to be a man and defend yourself? A look of anguish appeared in Elliot's eyes. He understood what his teammate was saying, and he would prefer not to become an experimental subject himself. But he was unsure how willing he was to help the company capture desperate people and submit them to experimental studies against their will. On the other hand, he knew he needed to become awakened if he wanted to survive. Your skills aren't bad, Finn told Charles when he evaded his first assault. Finn wasn't upset that his initial attack had failed. On the contrary, he seemed pleased to have found an opponent who might challenge him. Amid his taunts, he prepared to fight again. He slashed an arc of sword energy out in front of him, assuming there was no way Charles could manage to evade such an attack. But the arc-shaped sword energy only reached half of its intended trajectory before it stopped, and he felt the blade vibrate in his hand. He looked down at it in disbelief and asked in a trembling voice, What did you do? Only the hilt of the sword remained in his hand, and he gaped at Charles's white sword. Finn swore loudly as his sword fell to the ground, clanging against the hospital's tiled floor. It hadn't managed to complete a single move before Charles had destroyed it. Your sword is weak, Charles crowed. He brought the blood-drinking sword up to Finn's neck. Since you are also a powerful paranormal, he said mockingly, then I'm sure you know a lot about stellar technology. Tell me everything, or your head will join your useless sword down there. Cold sweat appeared on Finn's forehead. Although he was a paranormal, he didn't like his chances against Charles's blood-drinking sword. But when he spoke, it wasn't with fear. Will it? He asked tauntingly. Did no one ever tell you not to bring a knife to a gunfight? The next second, Charles felt the barrel of a pistol press against the back of his head, and he knew before he looked that the person holding the weapon was his friend Elliot. Charles had lost many things in his previous life. Although he had returned to the world much more cold-blooded and heartless than he had been, whenever he did experience emotions, he appreciated them more because he understood how precious they were. When he had realized Elliot was caught up with stellar technology, he had ignored the danger, wanting to pull his friend away from their evil clutches. He trembled slightly, not with fear, but from betrayal, and he was flooded with sadness, anger, and pain. He could have understood Elliot watching the fight from the sidelines. After all, He would obviously have been torn between his friends, and no matter what he did, he would have been forced to harm someone he cared for. But Elliot had chosen to get involved by attacking Charles, and that was shocking, not to mention unforgivable. "I can't let you hurt him, Charles," Elliot said, his voice chilly. "Let him go. Not even a paranormal can dodge a bullet at such close range." "Well done, Elliot," Finn said hoarsely. "I'll report your loyalty to the company, and you'll be rewarded for this." Elliot remained as expressionless as an ice sculpture. "If you want to become awakened, then I have a way," Charles said quietly. "You can still turn this around, so don't do this, Elliot." The sound of Charles saying his name seemed to jolt Elliot back to life, but he quickly regained his nerve and tightened his grip on the gun. "You should be the one switching sides," he said. "Do you think I believe you? I've known you long enough to know when you're bluffing. We're not writing essays in a dorm room anymore." "Put your gun down now and join me," Charles insisted. "I'll do my best to protect you. You know you won't be able to live with yourself if you kill me." Although Elliot was touched, he knew what he had to do to survive. Since the world had collapsed, he had witnessed too much death. During his numerous searches for resources, he had seen the horrors and darkness of the world in which he lived, and it had made him long to be stronger, to be awakened. He knew it was time for him to show his loyalty to Stellar Technology. "Don't move," Charles shouted at Finn, who had shifted slightly against the blade at his throat. Finn saw the threat in Charles's eyes and immediately stopped moving. He knew Charles was on the verge of losing his patience, and if he finally lost his temper, he might do something impulsive. Finn forced a smile and said, "Elliot's right. Join us." "Shut up," Charles shouted, and then he turned his attention to his former friend. "Elliot, put down the gun. We can still salvage this situation." But Elliot wasn't moved at all. Instead, he seemed to become even more decisive. "Don't be stupid," he said. "You're a paranormal. You don't know what it's like to be an ordinary person. We can't fight, and we can't protect ourselves or our families. I don't have a choice." Charles felt his heart grow cold. He had wanted so badly to think people could still be good and have principles, even in the face of something as terrible as the end of the world. And he wanted to believe people could be like his parents had been in his previous life, when they had loved him until the moment they had died. He didn't want to acknowledge the truth about human nature. When he had first seen Elliot, the surprise and happiness in the man's eyes had been genuine. Of that, Charles was sure. And Charles had been relieved, believing that their previous relationship meant he had found a friend and ally. But he also knew Elliot's desire to become a paranormal had sparked a deep resentment within him. As soon as he had realized Charles had become awakened, envy had prompted him to betray his friend. "Why don't we both take a step back?" Finn suggested. "If you put down the sword, then Elliot will put down the gun. Then we'll fight face to face. It'll be a fair fight." "I'll fight you face to face," Charles agreed. "And don't worry, you can trust me to be honorable." He looked pointedly at Elliot and said, "You're dead to me, Elliot." As he spoke, he pulled away and retreated through the hospital with the speed of a bolt of lightning. Elliot lowered the gun, his hands drenched in sweat. Finn patted Elliot's shoulder and said with satisfaction, "Well done. You saved my life today. From now on, you're my brother. As long as I live, I'll never let you suffer. No one will touch you." Elliot released a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. The pressure of his betrayal weighed heavily on him, but he told himself it had been a necessary evil. At Stellar Technology, paranormals were offered many more privileges than regular people. With Finn's support, his own status would rise, and when the genetic enhancement pill was successfully launched, he was guaranteed to be among the first to receive it. "Withdraw," Finn shouted. "Let's go back and report what's happened. We'll send others to collect resources. If this Charles wants to go against the company, then let's give him a taste of its true strength and resources. Let's make him suffer." The word resources triggered a memory for Elliot. "Wait a minute," he exclaimed, halting Finn in his tracks. "Before the apocalypse broke out, Charles told me he was expecting an outbreak of influenza. He told us all to stock up." A dangerous look flashed across Finn's face. "What are you saying?" he asked. "Are you going to make another plea for him?" A cruel look appeared on Elliot's face. "What I mean," he clarified, "is that he must have prepared a lot of supplies himself. If we follow him, we'll be able to take his stuff." You're an idiot, Charles chided himself. After everything you've experienced, you should have known better. Why did you trust him? Why didn't you just kill him? Hiding in an empty corner, Charles hugged his arms around his knees, berating himself. After all the people he had hurt and all the opponents he had faced, he couldn't believe that he hadn't had the strength to take out Elliot. He had no excuse other than he had been too naive. He had certainly experienced a great number of betrayals, but out of all of them, Elliot's was one of the worst. He had never expected that his friend would put a gun to his head, and he felt as though the pain of the treachery hurt more than a physical bullet ever could. It hurt him even more when he wondered whether Elliot would have even cared once he had pulled the trigger. Charles's heart filled with pain and frustration. He vaguely wondered whether there was a stray bottle of wine in his energy storage space. But then he realized that, even if there was, drinking in such a dangerous place would be suicide. He knew he had to shake the despair he was feeling, because he wasn't just surviving for his own sake. Both his sister and his girlfriend were very much alive and in need of his protection, and he knew how terrible they would feel if anything happened to him. Although they were both reasonably capable, he knew his existence made them stronger. In the back of his mind, he remembered that although there had been many betrayals, there were also people who had proven their worth and treated him well. People had died for him, and he knew he owed it to them to cherish every one of his remaining feelings. When he thought about the people he loved, he felt a sliver of warmth return to his heart, and he knew what his family would do. "Dad, Mom," he said audibly, "I love you guys." He thought about his parents' ability to think about others, and he knew he needed to find it in his own heart to forgive. "I understand," he said to himself. "I'll forgive Elliot and the others this time, but they better not cross me again." It would be easy for him to set up a trap to kill them, but he knew he had better and more important things to do. In addition, they didn't mean anything to him. Although he was annoyed at his former roommate, he didn't want to resort to murder for the sake of a broken friendship. Once he had decided to let the incident go, he lost interest in dealing with them. But at that moment, a black shadow returned to Charles's side. When Charles had fled Elliot's group, he left the Dark Mage behind to monitor them. He still wanted to obtain the genetic enhancement pill, and he was also concerned about Elliot's situation. The Dark Mage relayed Elliot's conversation with Finn, and when Charles heard the news, his expression turned cold and angry. "I spared your life out of kindness," he growled. "Is this how you repay me?" He hadn't anticipated that Elliot would double down on his betrayal and give up information from a private conversation they had shared in the past. He knew Elliot had told Finn about the influenza outbreak in order to cement his loyalty to Stellar Technology, but he was furious that he would stoop so low as to suggest stealing from Charles and his family. Apparently, Elliot was concerned that Charles might retaliate, and had therefore decided to eliminate him as a threat. Charles touched the tattoo on his arm and said softly, "Just you wait, Elliot Johnson. You're going to get a feast for dinner." His pain at the betrayal had vanished entirely the second Elliot had mentioned harming his family. Feeling resolved, he returned to his team. Tina was excited when she saw Charles heading back. She handed him a few medicinal crystal cores, as if she were offering him a priceless treasure. "We found some medicinal zombies," she explained, "but we took care of them all." She was slightly taken aback when she noticed the dark look on his face. Her team, however, didn't seem to notice his bad mood, and they happily jabbered away to him about their conquest. "We killed zombies, boss! Oh, I should have seen them. We took them all out." They had all previously been rescued by the army before they had encountered the monsters, and this was the first time any of them had faced the terrifying horde in real life. They were all thrilled with their achievement. "Good work," Charles commended them, managing a smile. "Let's find a place to hide. I just ran into a group of people who will be coming here any minute to try to kill us." Lena's eyes widened. Why? Unlike Charles, she had a great deal of faith in humanity. In Charles's previous life, he and his sister had been similar in their outlooks on life. But since his rebirth, the difference between them seemed immense, not only in their approach to life, but in their overall experiences. It made Charles feel like he was much older than her. "Ask me when it's all over," Charles told her. "But I need you to do something for me. I know you'll want to be involved, but I need you to sit this fight out, okay?" She began to argue, but he silenced her protests. "I promise I have a legitimate reason for asking you," he told her. "It's really important, Lena. If you don't stay here and keep quiet, then it's likely that you'll doom us all." Lena was shocked at his intensity, but she nodded to show she understood the gravity of the situation. She wasn't sure why Charles felt so strongly about the matter, but she also knew that he always had her best interests at heart, and she trusted his judgment implicitly. If he told her his life could be at stake, then she would obey his orders. Charles said to Harper and Blair, "I'm leaving the two of you in charge. Make sure she stays here. If she doesn't, I'll hold you responsible." Lena heard him and immediately objected. "Don't threaten my friends," she insisted. But Blair elbowed her and hissed, "It's fine. He's obviously serious about this." Harper nodded at Charles and said, "Don't worry, we'll look after her." Harper knew it had been an empty threat, and Charles had only said it in front of Lena so that she would stay put. After all, Lena was a loose cannon, but she would never let her friends take the blame for her actions. Charles's approach might be cruel, but Harper had to admit it was effective. "The rest of you," Charles said, "have two choices. The first is to hide in there until the rest of us come out." He pointed to an abandoned shopping mall next to him. "The second is to stay and fight these enemies with me. However, I can't guarantee anyone's safety, including my own." Alice immediately spoke up. "I'll stay." One of the team members suggested they should remain behind to create a reserve team. "We can create a second wave of fighters," he said. "Yeah," another agreed. "If it looks like they're winning, we can ambush them." Charles thought it was more likely that they were afraid and didn't want to be directly involved. But he had no reason to deny them, and he was pleased they didn't want to outwardly abandon him. So he went along with their idea and nodded his consent to the plan. "All right," he said. "Let's get into position." He cast his gaze around those who had chosen to stay behind. He was left with Tommy, Hugh, Tina, Alice, Sylvia, Hank, Elena, and a plain-looking man who had recently joined them. Charles was satisfied with the outcome. There was no such thing as loyalty, so he understood why the new recruits would be unwilling to risk their lives for him just because he was their leader. So if they were willing to stay, that meant they agreed with him. But he was surprised by the new recruit. Charles looked at the plain-looking man with a great deal of curiosity. "What's your name?" he asked. The man replied somewhat stiffly, "David Keller. I'm sworn into this team, and you're my leader. I've promised you my allegiance, and I meant it, so I'm here to fight for you." Charles patted his shoulder and said, "Thank you for your loyalty, David. I have a mission for you. Hide behind the mall door and take out every enemy that comes in." David's eyes filled with reluctance. "Are they all bad people, sir?" "They are all enemies," Charles replied firmly. David nodded hesitantly. As Charles had instructed, he hid behind the door of the mall and pressed himself against the wall until it was time for him to attack. Then Charles took out several submachine guns and handed them to Tina, Hugh, and a few of the others who didn't have superpowers. "Your duty is to cover the paranormals and suppress the attack," he told them. "I'll show you how to operate these." He gave them a quick demonstration. Hugh said worriedly, "But if we can't aim properly, then what should we do?" Some of them had seen guns on TV when they were younger, but in the real world, they were a rarity, and most people had never even seen one in person, let alone been asked to fire one under pressure. Despite Hugh's concerns, Charles knew they would be able to fire the weapons from a short enough distance, so accuracy wasn't a big concern. Charles smiled. "Don't worry about your aim," he assured him. "These things do almost everything automatically. All you need to do is point and shoot, and don't accidentally injure yourself." Privately, Charles was less concerned about their fighting prowess than testing their loyalty. Ordinary people wouldn't be much help in this battle, as the fight was going to be mainly between paranormals, and the few of those he had were mostly minors, or otherwise unsuitable to participate in a battle on the level he was anticipating. After arranging everyone's positions, he looked at the members who were hiding in every corner of the mall. Many of them were sneaking around to observe the situation and Charles's leadership. He turned to Alice and Sylvia. "Make sure you protect yourselves. Even paranormals aren't immune to bullets." A second-tier paranormal could resist bullets, but only provided they had access to medicinal energy. After Charles had ensured everyone was sufficiently prepared and hidden, he patiently waited for the arrival of the Stellar Technology team. His own small team hid themselves behind several cars outside the mall. They didn't have to wait for long, as a convoy of 6 cars approached within 10 minutes. Elliot didn't look out of the window of the car as he approached the mall. Instead, his eyes were fixated on the weapon in his hands. The worry in his heart had mostly disappeared, to be replaced with coldness and cruelty. Finn patted his shoulder and said, "If you can just find the place where Charles is hiding his resources, then that's a good enough contribution for today." At that moment, the team member who had been keeping a lookout through the sunroof reappeared inside the car. "I saw more than 20 people hiding in the mall," he exclaimed. "Some of the idiots stuck their heads out, and I was really tempted to shoot them." Finn smiled sinisterly. No, he said. "If they're pitiful enough to hide themselves away in a mall, then they obviously aren't capable of fighting a decent battle. It's better if we rescue them, and then they'll be willing to come with us as test subjects." The lookout turned to Elliot. "This is all thanks to you. The company will be so pleased you made such a great contribution to the cause." Elliot waved away the praise. "It's not about me," he insisted. "I just suggested we should follow Charles. This is all Finn's doing." "Don't be so modest," Finn insisted. "You're my right-hand guy. You saved my life today, and I'd never dream of taking the credit from you. Don't worry, I'll make sure everyone knows whose idea this was." Elliot was moved by Finn's generosity and his acknowledgement of his contribution, and he was pleased to be praised as the mastermind of the plot. "I did the right thing," he thought firmly. "Finn is a far better friend than Charles ever was. With Finn, I have a real shot at becoming a paranormal. That's better than Charles's false promises." He ignored any lingering traces of guilt. He needed to clear his conscience so that he didn't have to face the fact that his own envy had led to the betrayal of a long-standing friend. When he had seen Charles in the hospital, he had thought he was alone and needed help. Elliot's willingness to extend the hand of friendship had been genuine. It had only been once he had realized Charles was a paranormal that his allegiance had changed. He had been furious that Charles would pretend to be so pitiful when he was actually a trained fighter. That revelation filled his heart with envy and resentment, since he knew they were no longer equals in the game of survival. Combined with the temptation of becoming a paranormal, he knew he had to pledge his allegiance to stellar technology. Still, in the back of his mind, anxiety and fear lingered. He had eviscerated his friendship with Charles, and whatever happened next, he knew he wouldn't ever be able to return their relationship to what it had been. He wondered briefly how Charles would deal with him for his betrayal if he got the chance. Would he turn the tables and kill him? It was entirely possible. After all, if he were Charles, he wouldn't let a traitor go free. His only solution was obvious. He had to convince the other members of Stellar Technology to take Charles out for him. He had enticed them with a promise of stealing a sizable number of stores and supplies. If that was enough motivation to kill Charles, then the company would act. "Don't blame me, Charles," he thought. "This is just a preemptive strike. If anything, you should blame yourself for not recognizing the situation for what it was. I helped you out of kindness and told you to join us. Since you rejected my good intentions from the beginning, it's your own fault you're in this situation. It serves you right for not taking me seriously." With this thought in mind, he looked out the car window at the mall. He felt a flutter of excitement in his chest as the first car reached its destination and began to slow down. "Is this really your hiding place?" he wondered. "It's a miracle you survived until now, surrounded by monsters. Imagine living in such a lousy place and still trying to trick me into thinking you could turn me into a paranormal." With all of this going through his mind, he convinced himself more thoroughly that Charles was a liar. And with this notion firmly rooted in his heart, he dispelled any regrets he had been holding on to. There was a loud bang as the first gunshot rang out, and the bullet hit the first car in the convoy, causing sparks to fly. The rest of the fleet stopped immediately. "They have guns!" someone yelled. "It's just a gun," Finn retorted. "We have paranormals." "Yeah," someone agreed. "We don't need to be afraid of a gun when paranormals are around." Despite the initial concerns of several of the Stellar Technology members, they all still had absolute confidence in themselves. Not only did they have better numbers than paranormals, but they were superior in their confidence, and they knew their equipment was better. The Stellar Technology members exited their vehicles with their weapons in their hands. Every one of them was fully armed and had a gun. They numbered more than 30 after having received reinforcements. "Elliot," Charles shouted from behind an abandoned car. "I spared you earlier because you were my friend. What do you mean by bringing so many people here now?" Finn adopted a righteous look. "Obviously we're all here to save these people from your reign of terror," he said. "It must be hard for you all to live here, so I've come to take you all to a safe place." The members of Charles's team were thoroughly confused, and they wondered why these hostile strangers thought they lived in the abandoned mall. Nor did any of them understand who this man thought he was rescuing. When Finn realized none of Charles's team had any intention of leaving, his heart sank. "It seems that you've done a good job of brainwashing these people," he told Charles. "But your followers should think about this. You're trapped in a small place, so it's only a matter of time before you die. Your only hope of reaching safety is to come with us." If this crazy man and his friends hadn't been armed to the teeth, Charles's people wouldn't have been able to hold back their laughter. Charles sneered and said, "By safe, are you referring to the idea that we come to your lab and let ourselves be used as test subjects and sacrificed like rats?" Charles's communication device was turned on, so that the others in his team could hear the conversation from the front line. Harper and the others pieced together the meaning of Charles's words, and they realized that these people somehow intended to lure them to their side and deceive them. It also calmed some of their nerves when they realized that the aim of these people was apparently to capture rather than kill. It appeared they were worth more as living test subjects than corpses. Harper knew that this greatly improved their chances of coming out of the battle with fewer casualties. Finn ignored Charles and said, "Perhaps you don't believe that we have a method that allows you to possess strength that far surpasses ordinary people, but the others might want to possess strength comparable to paranormals." Charles's team members snorted in disbelief, and some of them shook their heads. They were already martial artists with strength that surpassed that of ordinary people. Although their relatively short cultivation time meant many of them hadn't yet achieved their full potential, they were definitely not ordinary people. Several of them laughed out loud at the stranger's presumption they would switch sides for such a useless bribe. Finn felt even more deflated by their seeming indifference. He hadn't expected that not a single person would listen to him. He had hoped at least one of them would be convinced, and then others would follow like dominoes. Suddenly, Alice, who was hiding near Charles, spoke up. "So I suppose all of you have this kind of power?" she asked. "Every one of you has strength that surpasses ordinary people?" Faced with Alice's question, Finn's followers released the safety on their guns. They knew they would have to use force to make these uncooperative people submit. "The technology isn't mature yet," Finn said evasively. "But believe me, eventually, everyone will possess the strength of paranormals." "This idiot wants to force you to become experimental subjects to carry out trials for a drug they haven't developed yet," Charles summarized. "Elliot, even if we aren't friends, don't you worry about yourself and your family? Do you want to risk your lives and be treated like lab rats?" There was little doubt left in the minds of Charles's followers, and they all had a healthy mistrust of these strangers. Not only did they have little interest in what Finn was trying to sell them, but it seemed that he didn't yet have anything to offer them anyway. Combined with the knowledge that they were expected to trial a strange drug that may or may not work, they quickly concluded that Finn was a scam artist with no intention of treating them well if they joined him. Elliot shouted, "Charles, I gave you this opportunity with good intentions, but you didn't appreciate it because you didn't value me as a friend. You never cared about me. And don't call me out for being a liar when you hid the fact you were a paranormal." Charles was so baffled by this accusation that he almost laughed. "Have you forgotten who it was that told you to prepare more supplies before the apocalypse broke out?" he asked incredulously. "I was kind enough to warn you, but I didn't expect you to use it as a bargaining chip and tell your dodgy friends to rob me and my family of our supplies." "How did you know that?" Elliot blurted out. Lena, who had been listening to the events unfold, felt a chill in her heart at Elliot's confession. She often viewed people with kindness, and she had a sympathetic and sunny attitude. Even though she had seen some dark things, she still had hope in her heart for humanity. But if Charles was telling the truth, then it meant his close friend had sold him out for the possibility of power, and that thought sickened Lena to her core. Elliot made no apologies for his behavior. "It's not my fault we don't agree on this," he insisted. "I did what I had to do. You guys can either hand everything over and follow us quietly, or else you could all die, and then we'll take everything you have anyway." When Charles's people heard his former friend threatening them, they all felt distinctly uncomfortable. They had all come across bad people before, but they believed these people were the worst of the worst. Apparently, Charles had helped this man out of kindness, only to be repaid with betrayal. Charles's tone turned icy. "You pointed a gun at my head earlier," he said, "and I could still have found it in my heart to forgive you. But threatening my family and friends is crossing the line." Charles's entire team was exhausted just listening to all the drama. Charles, for his part, hadn't needed to talk too much to lead the conversation in the direction he had wanted. He thought Elliot and his friend had done a good job of digging their own graves. He was certain that his teammates were beyond disgusted at Stellar Technologies' actions, and none of them would have much doubt who was in the right. His only reservation came from the knowledge Lena was listening to him through the communication device, and she might be devastated when she knew the complete story. He didn't want his sister to become a cold-blooded and heartless person, but he knew that it was important she gained a healthy awareness that not every stranger was a friend. In fact, not every friend was always genuine. As much as he didn't want to crush her spirit, she needed to have more vigilance if she wanted to survive in the post-apocalyptic world. Elliot's betrayal had been a lesson to Charles. To Lena, it was a subversion of her worldview. Harper whispered to Lena, "If this really had been our base and we had resources here, they would have come in and possibly killed us all or used us for these weird experiments. If Charles hadn't figured out their plan, how bad do you think this could have been?" Lena felt as if her heart had been pricked with needles. She felt as though everything her parents had taught her about the world had been a lie, and she finally began to understand Charles. He was clearly a good brother, and he had tried repeatedly to warn her about the world, but she had insisted she knew better. After this, she didn't know what to think. She considered her brother's roommate. How could someone do that? She wondered. How could he do something so cruel? If Charles hadn't had the confidence to deal with these terrible people, and if he hadn't been prepared, then we might have all died. When she thought about that terrifying prospect, she had to fight back tears. She had known Charles was jaded and cynical, but she hadn't realized he had experienced these terrible things personally. "Looks like you made your choice," exclaimed Finn. "Fire!" Instantly, all his men opened fire on Charles's hiding place. The firearms unloaded repeatedly, and the cars protecting Charles and the others were soon riddled with holes. Elliot felt proud when he saw the powerful effect of the firearms. Soon Charles will be dead, he thought, and then I won't have him on my conscience anymore. Neither he nor any of his so-called friends noticed the long black snake that was quietly approaching them from behind. Hellfire! A dark blue flame erupted from Charles's hiding place and launched itself into the crowd, causing a commotion, and many of them turned their anger on Elliot. "Didn't you say he was just a paranormal because of surgery?" one of them demanded. "Yeah, Elliot, you're a liar," accused another. I didn't know," Elliot insisted. He felt wrong because he hadn't realized the full scale of Charles's abilities. Then he remembered what Charles had said about forgiving him, since they were friends. He had originally thought it was just a ploy, but now he wondered if Charles had been sincere all along, and that his team really did have the ability to kill them all. "Don't panic," Finn yelled. A water-powered paranormal on Finn's team conjured a large amount of power of thunder and water, blocking the hellfire. "This might be an attack from one of his companions," Finn assured them all. Trusting his judgment, everyone in the Stellar Technology team calmed down a little. The initial attack had caught them by surprise, but after careful thought, they thought Finn's explanation seemed likely. At that moment, a crack suddenly appeared on the ground, and several of them called out, "Be careful! Look at the ground! Everyone run!" The cracks in the ground made them panic once again. Even Earth-powered paranormals weren't capable of such a thing. At that moment, a cloud of gray mist drifted toward them. "What's that?" one man asked, pointing at it. One of them was unable to dodge the fog in time and was enveloped. Soon his body began to dry up, and looking down at his withered and aged hands, he let out a miserable cry. Ice blade technique. Amid the chaos, Alice took the opportunity to attack. Her ice blade erupted from behind her and hit the legs of more than 10 people on Finn's front line, sending them all to the ground screaming. Charles's ice arrows and Sylvia's holy light purification worked together, killing and heavily injuring their enemies one by one. Charles's ordinary fighters didn't worry at all. Tina and the others emerged from the mall, firing their guns, protected by a wall of flames. Although the accuracy of their shots left much to be desired, their presence was enough to scare the enemy. When Finn's people saw that Charles's team also had powerful firearms, they panicked and lost their remaining will to fight. "How do they have so many guns?" "Run! We're no match for them! They're all monsters!" There were only 3 paranormals on Finn's team, and they were no match for Charles's warriors. They had thought their firearms would pose a stronger threat to the paranormals, and they hadn't expected their foes to be prepared, and therefore immune to their weapons. Since Charles's people also had guns, their own team had no tactical advantage whatsoever. They fled in panic, fighting each other in their attempts to escape back to their vehicles. All around them, their fallen colleagues cried out for help, suffering from the injuries inflicted by Charles's paranormals. Elliot was one of those hit by Alice's ice blade. Having lost the ability to move, he reached out to Finn for help. "Get lost," Finn exclaimed, not even looking at Elliot as he kicked his hand away. He was running for his life and wasn't about to stop for anyone. Elliot's heart filled with hatred as he watched his leader abandon him without a thought. "Curse you, you bastard!" he shrieked at Finn's retreating back. Almost as though the universe had answered his wish, he saw a black snake suddenly attack and then swallow Finn whole. "What the hell was that?" one of Elliot's comrades cried, his eyes wide. "It's a monster!" one of the others screamed. "Run!" The giant snake only added to the chaotic flight of the Stellar Technology team. A black bolt of lightning struck those who were still standing, causing them instant paralysis. "Hold fire," Charles commanded. Tina and the others immediately obeyed. They looked at the scene. The fight had been so one-sided that they couldn't really refer to it as a battlefield. None of their enemies were still standing. "Is that it?" Tommy asked in disbelief. They had surveyed their thoroughly beaten enemies. He and the others felt elated, as though the battle hadn't been real. After all, they weren't much stronger than ordinary people. They had still been afraid of their enemies' firearms, but they hadn't expected them all to fall so quickly. If it had been a direct confrontation, then they might have suffered some casualties. But as a result of Charles's careful strategy, they had taken down the Stellar Technology team without a single injury to anyone on their side. It was invigorating for the group to see how they could take down 30 fully armed people, including a few paranormals, so easily. Those who had been too afraid to fight were shocked at the apparent strength and efficiency of their leader. Even without the presence of a few machine guns, Charles and his two lieutenants had effectively wiped the floor with the vicious strangers. Their strength was inspiring. When they considered the fates of Finn's followers, they felt incomparably lucky. They were all convinced that ordinary paranormals didn't possess the strength Charles did, and many of them wondered in awe at his true potential. They considered that they possibly hadn't witnessed even a fraction of his true strength that day. A sense of admiration and pride rose within the hearts of every person who had seen Charles in action, thoroughly convincing them that he was a leader worth following. "How are we going to deal with these people?" Tommy asked Charles, referring to the paralyzed people on the ground. But before Charles could answer, a water spear rocketed toward Tommy's chest. Tommy felt his entire body go numb with fear, and he thought he was going to die. But before the spear made contact, a golden light blocked its trajectory. The weapon collided with the light spear and turned back into a splash of water before dissipating into the air. "If the enemy isn't dead, then don't ever let your guard down," Charles warned him softly. Then he killed the paranormal who had been playing dead. "The best way to confirm a paranormal's death is to ensure you take their head," he explained patiently. "And since there are some instances where they can survive for some time, even without their heads, you ought to always burn their bodies to ashes." With Charles's rich experience, the trick of playing dead hadn't fooled him at all. Even if his opponent's acting was flawless, he never let his guard down until they had been reduced to ashes. He knew it was callous, but there was no other way. Tommy knew he had narrowly avoided death. He regulated his breathing and then gasped. "Thank you, Charles." Hugh and Tina were also immediately on alert. Tommy was only one step ahead of them, and they wondered if they had been in his place, would they have been able to dodge the attack? Charles seemed to sense their thoughts because he said to them all, "There are still a lot of things you need to learn. I want to make sure that you don't pay for a lack of knowledge with your lives." Tina thought deeply for a second. "So," she said hesitantly, "do you mean we should kill all of these people?" At this suggestion, their remaining enemies all begged for mercy. "We were wrong. Yes, and we surrender. We were forced to attack." Elliot looked at Charles, who was slowly walking toward him, and his heart filled with panic. "Charles," he cried pitifully, "we were like brothers. We shared a dormitory. You can't kill me. We played games together. Remember, we ordered takeout, and I helped you in class. We were drinking buddies." Now that his life was in Charles's hands, Elliot's thoughts turned to his own survival. Charles surveyed Elliot with an icy gaze. "Stop the pathetic pleading. Do you want these to be your last words?" he asked. Lena and the others approached Elliot to watch Charles make his decision. Before the attack, Lena might have prevented him from killing his friend. But when she remembered how willing Elliot had been to hurt Charles and everyone he held dear, she gave up any thought she had of pleading on his behalf. When Elliot saw that Charles had no intention of letting him go, he instead shouted bitterly,
Do you think you were so great just because you're a paranormal? You think you're amazing just because you've awakened, and now you look down on someone who's too weak to be your friend anymore? I wanted to be stronger. But what's wrong with that? So what if I was happy to risk my life for it? I'm going to die now anyway, but at least I took my shot. Charles felt exhausted by the moral dilemma Elliot posed. He had experienced a lot of betrayal in his previous life, and he didn't want it to continue in his new one. Although he had met many unreasonable people, he still felt uncomfortable at the thought of killing a former friend. Elliot was becoming hysterical, and soon his thought patterns didn't seem to follow regular logic. He looked at the people behind Charles. "You guys have no idea what kind of enemy you've offended," he cried, sounding desperate. "And you have no idea what it will mean for you when everyone surpasses the limits of ordinary people. You're all finished." He laughed hysterically. "But it's not that difficult to surpass the limits of ordinary humans," Tommy said. "We all have that kind of power." At that, Elliot was stunned, and then he went into denial. "Are you all liars?" he asked pompously. "Do you know the price you have to pay to surpass the limits of humans if you aren't a paranormal?" You can't even begin. Before he could finish his sentence, Tommy gently lifted his palm toward him, and a strong wind blew past Elliot's face. Elliot was stunned into silence, feeling like his worldview had collapsed in an instant. Following Tommy's display, Q swung his knife, and a stream of saber energy shot into the air and cut a wound on the thigh of a captive a short distance away. "No," Elliot cried. "That's impossible. It's a trick." He couldn't face the fact that he had needlessly betrayed a close friend for something he could have obtained without making any sacrifice. He refused to believe that his primary ambition, the thing he had coveted for so long, had been obtained so easily by so many others. Charles looked around quickly. "Don't demonstrate yet," he told his team. "The battle has probably already attracted monsters. Before we deal with these guys, we need to kill any zombies that come for us." When Charles reminded them of that fact, everyone finally realized that the violent, albeit uneven fight would certainly have attracted hordes of zombies and other monsters. Sure enough, it wasn't long before the creatures came ambling toward them, moving stiffly. There were even some mutated zombies amid the large group. "Don't be afraid," Charles shouted. "Fight to the death," someone else called. "Be careful," another man warned. "There's no remedy if you're bitten." After their previous battle, Charles's actions had left a deep impression on the group's confidence. With such a powerful man leading their homemade army, they all felt incredibly proud and almost invincible. Even in the face of such terrible monsters, they no longer felt afraid. After all, one of them thought, with Charles at the helm, what danger can possibly come to us? But Charles didn't want their previous success to result in dangerous overconfidence. He wanted to ensure his army remained vigilant. He pointed at a few mutated zombies. "You two can deal with this type of zombie, right?" he asked Alice and Sylvia. They both nodded and started to fight. They weren't as experienced as Charles, but he encouraged them to do their best. The women decided to stick to long-range attacks so that even if they made a mistake, there was time to make up for it. They were both slightly amused at the idea of using mutated zombies as a form of training. Harper shot Charles a questioning look. When he nodded, she rushed toward the zombie group with her saber raised. The paralyzed captives on the ground were all shocked and began to whisper to each other. Are they all crazy? Do they think they can fight zombies with a saber? Do they think they're paranormals? Obviously, they all want to die. They're not as strong as their leader, so what are they doing? But the ridicule quickly stopped when they saw the team in action. A few mutated zombies still posed a threat to the ordinary fighters, but with Alice and Sylvia, who were third-tier paranormals, leading the attack, they were more than a force to be reckoned with. The remaining regular zombies didn't pose a threat to any of Charles's people, who were already capable martial artists. The only worry was ensuring that no one was accidentally splashed by or ingested any of the monster's tainted blood. Charles had little concern about the safety of his people. They had already passed his special training, and he had every faith in their abilities. He was so unconcerned that he felt he owed it to his team to let them take the lead. He knew that, spurred on by his earlier display, they would want to prove themselves to him. Happy to let them do so, he decided he would only step in if his presence was required. Finn's people couldn't believe the strength of Charles's group. They had attended simple training before setting out to collect resources, but they were nothing compared to this group of fighters. They were finally forced to acknowledge that these people really had surpassed the limits of the human body. All the fallen soldiers were suddenly in turmoil. because it meant that the things that they had painstakingly researched and suffered for were attainable without any of the dreadful means they themselves had applied. Lena didn't kill any zombies, but instead seemed lost in her own thoughts. Charles approached her. "In case you have any doubts about my decision," he said, "I want to tell you the whole story." He recounted to her his entire shared history and subsequent fallout with Elliot. Lena had thought the clarity would ease her feelings of uncertainty, but she felt as though it had only served to make her more confused. "I can't believe someone who has been friends with you since college would do such an awful thing," she said. "If someone's capable of that, then how can anyone trust anyone else again?" She felt a little scared at the prospect. "I don't know," Charles admitted. "We were basically like brothers when we lived on campus at college. When he thought I might be in trouble, he even wanted me to join Stellar Technology and have a place to live. He stood up for me, and I know he was worried about me." Lena asked, "But why did he turn on you?" She didn't understand how Elliot could be so vicious. How could he be happy to kill his friend's family? Elliot, who had overheard their conversation, cried silently. Charles continued his conversation with his sister. "It was fine when we were equal," he said. "We were always there for each other. If I had managed to prove to him sooner that I could help him get what he wanted, then he would have come with me in an instant. We would probably have continued to be friends." Elliot knew Charles was telling the truth. If he had known Charles could have helped him to surpass the talents of ordinary people, then he would have followed him to the ends of the earth. He cried even harder, and for the first time, he was filled with regret. "But it's not okay to be like that," Charles told his sister gravely. "Friendship shouldn't be a power struggle, but nowadays, everyone seems willing to abandon morality. Some people would rather starve than take other people's things. But when they see their own families starving, they usually break their moral code. Elliot thought his life was more valuable than mine. It's as simple as that. He knew if I wasn't with Stellar Technology, then I'd probably be an enemy. And because I was stronger than him, he needed to eliminate the threat." Seeing his sister so conflicted, Charles gave her a rare hug. "I know this is a lot for you. You don't need to be a different person because of this. You just need to learn to be on your guard and recognize bad people. Trusting the wrong people can put not only yourself in danger, but also the people you love." Happy with how the conversation had gone, he finally approached Elliot. Elliot looked as though he had accepted his fate. "So, Charles," he said, "how is this going to end?" Charles had analyzed his feelings, and he had considered the matter more than any other decision he had ever made. "When I was in the hospital," Charles said, "I could have killed all of you. But because we were friends, I spared you. Even when I found out you were against me, I let it go." He raised his blood-drinking sword. "But I have other people to consider aside from myself. You were willing to steal from my family and cause them harm for your own gain. And that breaks any ties of friendship we ever had. I'm sorry it has to end like this." He raised the sword above his head. "Blood-drinking sword, fall!" he cried.